story of the Black Knight begins way back in 1899. Nikola Tesla, an inventor from Croatia, announced he was receiving an electrical signal which appeared to be intelligent. The signal was clearly repeated periodically with such a clear suggestion of number and order. This led him to believe that the signal was extraterrestrial communication. At first, he assumed that they were originating from Mars. Later, he changed that opinion and stated in a conference that the signal was coming from somewhere else in space. Fast forward to the 1920s, and various ham radio operators began to receive strange coded messages. One ham radio enthusiast recorded the signal and claimed he deciphered it, saying that it was a star chart centered on the Epsilon Bootis star system. In 1928 in Holland and again in 1929 aboard a research vessel in the South China Sea, they were transmitting sounds over the radio. The return echoes were examined, and they were not as neatly spaced as had been sent. In fact, they were highly irregular, ranging from 1 to 30 seconds in delay time. At the time, the discrepancies were explained as fluctuations in the ionosphere or magnetic disturbances, but the pitch or frequency of the sounds did not change, only the spacing of the echoes. In the 1970s, this mystery was carefully examined and deciphered by Duncan Noonan, a scientist from Scotland. He plotted a vertical axis of the transmitted pulse sequence with a horizontal axis of echo delay time. The result was once again a picture of the constellation Bootis as it would have looked 13,000 years ago.
December 25th, 1952, famous mathematician Lancelot Hogben called upon the scientific community to send radio signals deep into the solar system. Hogben said he had no desire to visit Mars, but it might be a good idea to have a few chats with the Martians before sending rockets across space for a possible unfriendly reception. Hogben planned to send a simple code through a series of radio messages in the hope that extraterrestrials would receive and decode them, and then send some kind of response. Did extraterrestrials receive these signals? And did we get a response which has resulted in one of the biggest cover-ups in human history? March 4th, 1954. Over 3 years before the launch of the first man-made satellite Sputnik 1, the Los Angeles Times released an article suggesting that scientists had reason to believe that some small objects may be orbiting the Earth. Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of the planet Pluto, and Dr. Lincoln La Paz, an astronomer from the University of New Mexico and a pioneer in the study of meteors, were assigned to search for the orbiting bodies. 2 months later, Major Donald Keyhoe, the head of the biggest UFO research organization at the time called the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, announced in an interview that 1 or 2 artificial satellites in an unfamiliar retrograde orbit had been detected by Air Force radar at White Sands. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner released stories about the detection. The reports contained a notice from Canadian government scientists asking any skywatchers to be especially alert and called for them to report any unidentified aerial objects that they had seen over the previous 2 weeks. Aviation Week broke the same story in August 1954. They confirmed Keyhoe's claim that there were 2 large objects orbiting the Earth, one at 400 miles and one at 600 miles above the Earth. They claimed that the objects were natural space rocks or asteroids, but scientists soon rejected the notion that Earth could capture natural objects that would take a retrograde orbit around the planet. In January 1960, the Dark Fence satellite surveillance system detected another anomalous object which this time was in polar orbit. The commanding officer of Dark Fence raced to the Pentagon and reported the menacing stranger to the Chief of Naval Operations, and within minutes the news was communicated to President Eisenhower and marked as top secret. 3 weeks after its discovery, it was made public and featured on the front page of many newspapers. The article stated that 2 months before this, Discoverer 8 had been fired into space and was still in orbit. But Navy trackers who keep a watch on all space objects said they knew the exact whereabouts of the Discoverer rocket casings, and that this object was definitely not one of them. At first it was thought that the object had been put there by the Russians. There was also some speculation that it was a stray British rocket from the Black Knight project. At the time, putting an object into a polar orbit and keeping it there was a feat that neither the British nor the Russians had been able to accomplish. But the object was soon dubbed the Black Knight, after the aforementioned British rocket. It took 1 whole month until Time magazine released an article offering the official explanation. And even though the Navy had previously stated that they knew the exact whereabouts of the Discoverer satellites and that the only one still orbiting was Discoverer 8, it contradictorily stated the evidence from both Air Force and Navy pointed to Discoverer 5, which was fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California in August 1959. In March 1960, a mysterious satellite was investigated by the CIA. The object was observed on March 6th by the crew of a Swedish Airlines plane. The captain's report stated that judging from all the circumstances, it was an unidentified satellite. It was very bright and moving in a northwesterly direction just after 8 p.m. He said without a doubt it was some form of satellite. The same object was also observed from the Stockholm Observatory. An employee said that it seemed to be a satellite and that he was certain it wasn't a meteor. Both sightings were reported in the Swedish newspaper Today's News. The CIA report also talks of a so-called phantom satellite known as 1960 Alpha, which was also observed over Stockholm in Sweden on the same day. It was said to make a 90-degree turn before disappearing below the horizon. Another skywatcher was waiting to observe the phantom satellite at exactly the same time when he saw 2 objects which looked and moved like satellites make a 180-degree turn. In September 1960, reports of strange retrograde satellites were increasing and were causing quite a stir in the physics and astronomy community. Amateur astronomers from coast to coast and from Michigan to Missouri had reported seeing the objects. One object was said to appear at around the same time as the Echo 1 satellite, which was launched on August 12, 1960. Grumman Aircraft Corporation decided to set up a tracking station to capture a photograph of this mystery object. And on August 25, 1960, they were successful. This is the actual photograph taken by Grumman, and it's still the only confirmed photo of one of the mystery satellites available to the public. Grumman also confirmed that the object appeared around the same time as the Echo 1 satellite. They said that the color of the object varied from carrot to straw, and that the object was in a retrograde orbit traveling in an easterly to westerly direction. A few days before, on August 17th, this picture was taken in Bloomfield, Connecticut. It shows the Echo 1 satellite with an unknown object passing it on a strange orbit. In 1966, J. Allen Hynek from the Air Force's Project Blue Book wrote a long letter to Science magazine in which admitted the existence of unexplained UFO photos and radar tracking, and called for an end to the ridicule of reliable witnesses. He said Air Force reports included unexplained UFO photos, radar tracking, and unexplained pictures from Project Moonwatch and satellite tracking cameras. He also wrote about the existence of a photograph of a retrograde satellite taken 2 years before the Grumman photo. He said that the unidentified object's speed, as calculated at Chicago's Adler Planetarium, was 3 times that of any Earth-launched satellite. Unfortunately, Project Blue Book was shut down just 4 years after this, leaving the Air Force's study on the object incomplete. But one case of a retrograde satellite does remain in the Blue Book archives. The report states that an object was spotted in June 1963. The object was in orbit and traveling 1.5 times the speed of a regular satellite. Arose as to whether they were artificial or natural. John P. Bagby, who worked in the research division of the Hughes Aircraft Company, wrote some articles concerning these odd satellites. In 1966, he wrote an article for the Nature Journal, stating that during the mid-50s he analyzed evidence of 2 swarms of such objects in retrograde orbits. He said that the brilliance of the objects to the naked eye caused most persons contacted to doubt that they were natural. He goes on to say that one of the objects had disappeared, and he thinks that it may have been a natural space rock which had decayed in the Earth's atmosphere during January 1966. So did it decay in Earth's atmosphere? Not according to Bagby's follow-up article, in which he states that he was able to optically observe the object in January 1967. He said that scientists had observed some strange radio anomalies, but they could not trace the origin. Bagby later analyzed the data, and was able to correlate it with the orbit of the retrograde satellite. He also suggests that the objects have changed orbit. He discusses various possibilities, however the analysis is inconclusive, and he thinks that further direct observations of the objects are needed to further determine their orbit. In 1981, Bagby clarifies that at least one retrograde satellite is still in orbit, and notes that a retrograde satellite had been spotted in orbit as early as 1880, when a group of retrograde bodies were seen orbiting over Germany. This was reported in the Nature Journal at the time. Despite all these observations, scientists remained adamant that the Earth would not be able to capture a natural satellite that would take a retrograde orbit around the planet. So after all of these observations, the question is still not settled. Could it be that these mysterious satellites are actually artificial, but scientists do not want to risk their reputation and say that there are 1 or more UFOs orbiting the planet? If you want to get an article published in a journal like Nature, you cannot say that Earth is being orbited by UFOs. To the readers of Nature and the general public, a natural satellite sounds more probable, and yet science does not accept the latter as fact. So what is going on? And is there any evidence of a cover-up? In 1961, computer scientist Jacques Vallée and his team were working at the Paris Observatory tracking satellites. They started tracking unusual objects that were not man-made satellites. The objects were quite elusive, but the team decided that they would pay close attention to the objects, even though they were not on the schedule of normal satellites. One night they were able to get 11 data points for one of the objects. They found that it was in a retrograde orbit, and noted that it was very bright and prominent. That same night, the person in charge of the project confiscated the tape, and the next morning he erased it through fear of ridicule. These events contributed to Vallée's long-standing interest in the UFO phenomenon. In an interview, Vallée stated that other observatories had made exactly the same observation, and that there was a lot of data that was never published. Adler Planetarium director Robert L. Johnson and his colleague Frank Judson had been studying a mysterious orbiting object which would intermittently appear. Speaking in a Newsday interview in 1960, they both positively stated that the object was not an artificial satellite or space rock. Judson said the object didn't maintain a regular schedule like other orbiting bodies, and that it appeared some nights, and some nights it didn't. They also confirmed that when it did appear, it was usually at about the same time as Echo 1, but going in the opposite direction and about twice as fast. The object was orbiting the planet at an incredible speed, and it remained unidentified. But when Judson was asked the inevitable question, he said he doesn't know what the strange object is, but he doesn't believe in UFOs. Finally, in 1954, Captain Howard T. Orville, head of the President's Weather Control Commission at the White House, was questioned on WFBR radio by Lou Corbin, who served in the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps during World War II. He was asked if he knew of any condition under which two objects could enter the Earth's atmosphere and pick up orbiting at 400 and 600 miles out. To which he replied, "Not that I know of. Your doubts are well justified." Mr. Corbin then asked if the two bodies might be space stations. Captain Orville replied, "Well, that is an interesting thought. I don't know of any set of circumstances that would account for two natural objects orbiting around the Earth." During a broadcast with the same station 3 years later, Captain Orville said that he held the same ideas on unknown satellites orbiting the Earth as he had previously expressed. When asked if there was any new information about the unknown satellites, Captain Orville said that it appeared that the military might have kept the matter from publication. "From the American people?" asked Mr. Corbin. In reply, Captain Orville said he did not wish to call it a deliberate cover-up. He then added, "But we didn't hear any more about it, did we?" So there we have it. Evidence of a cover-up, and the answer to why scientists do not accept that the Earth could capture natural satellites in a retrograde or polar orbit. Because whatever these things are, there is an enormous amount of evidence which suggests that they are not natural. They didn't maintain a regular orbit. They appear and disappear, and have an odd color. They also change direction and reflect radio signals, which is impossible for natural objects. In more recent years, we have multiple UFO reports from astronauts and numerous videos of various space shuttles being tracked by UFOs whilst in orbit, adding to the evidence that the Earth is being visited. Maybe Lancelot Hogbin's radio signals did prompt these strange satellites to appear in orbit around the Earth, or maybe they have always been here.
Slightly earlier than this, in March 1960, Time magazine released an article explaining that a mysterious dark satellite had been detected in orbit by the US. The US once again went into a blind panic, thinking that it could be a surveillance satellite launched by the Russians. It took 2 whole weeks before an official explanation was issued. The explanation was that the evidence from both Air Force and Navy pointed to Discoverer 5, which was fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California on the 13th of August, 1959. Discoverer 5 had been orbiting for 7 months at this point. Surely they were well aware of its position by now? With the 2-week silence and poor explanation, everything pointed to a cover-up. In December 1998, Space Shuttle Endeavour was launched on a mission to dock with the International Space Station. All of these links are to the following photos that were taken during the mission. To see the rest of the photos, either go to the links which will be posted below, or see our other video on the Black Knight. The photos are labelled as space junk on NASA's website. They were also once labelled as a blanket which was lost on the mission, and even a seat. If they are any of these, then why keep changing the explanation? Many people believe that this is just another NASA cover-up, and that these are actually images of the Black Knight satellite. Whether these are actual pictures of the Black Knight or not, with all of the evidence contained in this video, we know that the Black Knight is real, and that it's probably still in orbit to this day. And being in polar orbit, we know that whoever put it there wanted it to be found. Whether NASA or anybody else has responded yet is not known, and probably won't be for a very long time.
Guys, about 2 weeks ago on the Blog Talk radio show, Michael brought up the Black Knight. You've all seen this picture on the internet. It's taken by the space shuttle a few years ago. Now, a lot of people have said that it was photoshopped, and I'm going to show you that it's not Photoshop. Brief history of this is that mystery polar satellite believed Russian spotted. Now, it's not Russian. It's an unidentified silent satellite has been discovered circling the Earth in a near polar orbit by U.S. tracking stations. The identity and origin of the mystery satellite, which was been dubbed the Dark Satellite, are not known despite nearly 2 weeks of tracking. Guys, it goes back much further than 1960. I was going to say the most telling detail is that the satellite does not behave normally. Even early on, astronomers would note they'd see it for a time, then it would be gone, only to return later. These are some close-ups, guys, I brought up, and without much enhancement other than increase the resolution as much as possible. That's what we're looking at. And it looks ancient, guys. It looks very old. Now, one of the ham operators that picked it up early on said that the code said it was 13,000 years old. But what I wanted to do, make sure it's not Photoshop, I went to NASA. See this link here? And I will link this in the description of this video, guys. But I'm going to bring it up closer, and this is what was seen. Now, the first image that they thought was photoshopped in the top right there, they had come around into the sunlight. And this bottom image, which is part of the NASA crew observation, notice this page, it's got 4 images on it. I will link to it also. But while it was not in the sunlight, these 4 pictures were taken. Probably a lot more than that, but that's what we're dealing with here. Now, think about this. Tesla was in contact with something that was multiple languages. He said some were not known languages. That in his early contact, when he was building his first antennas and experimenting with power, you think he may have learned a few things here? Again, I'm just going through some close-ups, guys, and some high grains of this thing. But let's pull it up. I think the 13,000 years could be very accurate, and I'll tell you why. Let's look at this. I'll pull it up. Now, again, this is at night. You notice that you have the top turret and the back turret. See the picture in the top left? Now, look at it from this angle. You have that back tail and the center turret. They're both visible. Again, this is the same flight, so it was not a photoshopped image. Now, guys, what happened about 13,000 years ago besides the Indians having to hit the mud in the Carolinas because of the meteors? The flood did. This talks about Tesla. He worked many years to perfect the receiving and transmitting equipment that was needed to better pick up and translate these possible alien broadcasts. He was picking up. This is back in 1899, and he talked about it all the way to 1925, guys. Again, here's some close-ups. But again, roughly 13,000 years ago, both we had the meteor impacts called the Carolina Bays in that area, and that's around the time of the flood, guys. Also is a half cycle in the galactic circle. If we go through that galactic plane twice every 26,000 years. Now, again, the flood, and I want to talk about that. Again, if you hear something that's strange, don't freak out about it. Just bear with me here. I want to talk about this in the Bible and even older texts. Revelation 11:9, it says, "The temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in the temple the ark of his testament. There were lightnings, voices, thunderings, and an earthquake, and great hail." Now, what was John told about these thunders? He said, "Seal up these things when the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not." Okay? We're getting right before the end times here. Notice at the top, the nations are angry. They destroy those who destroy the earth. Notice that? Okay, where's the ark? It's in heaven. When those thunders happening, we're going to see it. Now, let's look at something else, guys. If you haven't checked out my Nibiru videos, check them out. This is Sumerian. In preparation for the flood, Enki and Nimrod buried the records and computer programs deep in the Iraqi soil, but they prepared genetic banks of earth creatures to save from coming flood. Male and female essences and life eggs they collected of each kind 2 by 2. What they collected for safekeeping while in Earth circuit, to be taken thereafter, the living kinds to recombine. The day of the deluge they awaited. Now, if you have studied those Sumerian texts, you know that they knew for 3 years that this was going to happen. And they traveled around the world. And they did have a wooden ark. They also had this ship. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Had to be. Fukushima, now they're saying, is 5 times worse than we knew about a week ago, and it has been since the entire incident started. 5 times more radiation. The mist, and it says there's the mist of the street. On either side of the river there was trees of life which bare 12 manners of fruit, and yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. Guys, this is after Christ sets his foot down. This is the beginning of the millennium. Where does the ark come from? Comes from heaven. Where does the city come from? Comes from heaven. Goes on to say that, behold, I come quickly. Blessed is he that keepeth the sayings of the prophecies of this book. Now, guys, that ship is ancient. Again, they collected for safekeeping while in Earth's circuit to be taken. That ship is still there, if this is what I think it is, and it looks ancient. Now, if they know this is here, why haven't they messed with it? Again, we talked about on the radio show many times, they don't have the technology. This thing can move. It probably has technology to destroy anything that attacks it. Now, also, what if the elite are told this is their ark? They wouldn't attack it, would they? We're really not sure what we're dealing with, guys. I'm looking at past history, looking at what we have before us. It's a heads up. Be safe.